I'm Mary Owens with OnPoint, and today we are in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the offices of Bridgeworks, a company that specializes in helping us understand the various generational issues and how they view things. Our guest speaker today that's with us is Hannah Ubel. Before we start, could you tell us a little bit about Bridgeworks and what you do here?
Yes, and I'm very happy to be here with you talking about generations, and that's exactly what we do at Bridgeworks. We've been doing it for 18 years. All we talk about is generations, and that really means in the workplace and the marketplace, how can you better understand the different generations that you're engaging with on a regular basis so you can have productive conversations with them. So we help companies in a variety of ways to do that.
Maybe we should start with explaining which generations are in America today and what are their age ranges and how big is each group?
It's a great place to start because there's a lot of information out there that breaks down generations in different ways. There's no hard science around it. The way we break them down is traditionalists are born before 1946. Other people might call them the matures, the GI generation, the silent generation, the greatest generation. That is this group. And according to the 2010 US Census, there are around 75 million. So that's the traditionalists. After traditionalists are baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, and they're a group of 80 million. Lots and lots of baby boomers, which has, of course, many implications, as you can imagine. And Generation Xers, born between 65 and 79, they're a smaller demographic, only 60 million. So they're sandwiched between two giant generations. Millennials come after Gen Xers. Millennials are also known as Generation Y. They're synonymous. Yes. So I'll use millennials, but others use Generation Y. Neither one is right or wrong. Born between 80 and 95, and we're 82 million strong.
So they are larger than the baby boomers.
Larger than the baby boomers, and part of that is because of immigration patterns. Yes. We were only supposed to be around 75 million, but 1 in 4 of our generation is Hispanic. So I'm a millennial, by the way. When I say my generation, hopefully it's obvious I'm a millennial, but yes, that's my cohort.
And after the millennials, what?
Yes, after the millennials, there's an entire other generation or two, and we're really looking at the demographic born about 1996 to 2010, and a lot of the media calls them Generation Z. We don't really like that name. What we call them is Generation Edge. They've grown up in a pretty scary world, so they've developed this resiliency and this edge.
And that brings up a good point. Each one of these generations have grown up in a different environment. Their world was very different, the traditionalist versus edge. Could you give us an idea of the standard experiences that each generation has and how that affects their views?
It's hard to package it in a small amount of time, but I will do my best. So, and what you're talking about, the time that you're growing up, that really impacts your traits and your values and how you view the world. And so what we look at is what do you experience in your formative years? So roughly when you're a teenager, what's going on in the world at that time, how does that shape who you are? So traditionalists, if you look at that generation, if you think about really big things that impacted them, it's the Great Depression, it's World War II, it's a time of sacrifice.
Yes, it was.
It was a huge time of sacrifice. So they had to learn how to save. This generation is still a group who stashes money all around their house because you never know when something bad is going to happen, right? So you save all that you possibly can.
And they're terrified to spend it, no matter what.
Terrified to spend it, right. But they don't want to talk about it either, right? Like that's a whole other
Money is taboo.
Exactly. It's a taboo topic. You don't talk about it. And that they still hold that with them today. And a lot of that is about respect for this generation. And also something, too, with them that we look at is this group built so many institutions in this country, and they're fiercely loyal to those institutions. They're loyal to people they've had relationships with for years. Think about their doctors, their bankers, their grocer down the street, their financial advisor. They stick with one person for a long time. It's just ingrained in who they are. They're very, very loyal.
That's part of their value system.
Exactly, yes. And it's a value that other generations, quite frankly, we just don't have it in the exact same way. We aren't as dedicated to that loyalty like they are.
So the next one down, after the traditionals, the baby boomer. I'm a baby boomer.
Okay.
So clearly our views were very different than the traditionalists.
Yes.
So I remember things like Kent State and Vietnam War and all those things that started to come around and really shape the world. Right. I have a very different view than I'm sure you do in your experiences.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about them a little bit.
With baby boomers, one thing we always look at is change. I mean, boomers, they wanted to change the world. They fought to change the world. They looked at their parents and said, I love you. But right? And that's the counterculture movement of the 60s was all about change. And it was the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-war movement. And it's something, too, I will say as a millennial, when I look to baby boomers and I do ask them questions about that time, it was a time of empowerment. Like everyone felt like they could be dedicated to a cause. And so when we really look at that generation, too, one thing we find is that because they were there with so much change, they saw their leaders assassinated, many of them. Even when they did, they kept fighting. Didn't sit back, and change happened. So they're a pretty optimistic and idealistic generation. A lot of boomers have this can-do kind of attitude. Like if you dedicate yourself and you work hard,
you can do it. You can do anything.
Exactly, you can do anything. And one thing we talk about too, and so I will ask you as a boomer, but if you look at the institution of NASA, what's your first memory of NASA?
Oh, it was Man on the Moon.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How did it feel to see that happen?
It was probably in the top 10 most exciting things I ever saw. So let's talk about Gen Xers a little bit.
Gen Xers, very different generation. And honestly, usually when we talk about generations, they're forgotten. They're called the forgotten middle child. They're sandwiched between two giant and a little bit louder generations. And Xers were always seen as, slackers and apathetic. And that's, of course, not who they are. But when you think about events and conditions for this group, when they were kids, they were told, you're not going to do as well as your parent. So right out of the gate, they're like, cool, I can't wait to grow up. This is fantastic.
I have such an encouraging platform to enter this.
Exactly. And a lot of the world around them was, it was darker. It wasn't as positive. So if you think about Disney, it's the first time that they laid off animators. There were less fun Disney movies made during this time. And the Xers really consumed media at a high rate. Cable television, MTV, watching music videos on loop, Saturday morning cartoons, after school specials. There was constant time.
They were constantly getting hit with sound bites.
Exactly.
All sorts of information, and the level of it was radically increasing, and the velocity of it.
Think about the media too. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a newspaper form. It was 24-hour news for the first time.
Yes.
And if you think about CNN and all the stories that they were covering, and if any of them were positive, I mean, they saw every institution crumble. It was Enron, it was WorldCom, I mean, political scandals. They just learned from an early age that you can't necessarily trust what everyone is saying. And to the point of NASA, too, there's this interesting generational juxtaposition where if you ask a room full of Gen Xers, what is your first memory of NASA? The first thing they say is the Challenger explosion. So when we look at this generation as a whole, they question. Generation Xers learned early that they can't necessarily trust institutions, politicians, leaders, maybe their parents.
So some cynicism definitely was part of their culture.
And sometimes cynicism is looked at negatively, so we use the word skepticism, but it's really synonymous. And for a lot of Xers, it's kind of like, of course I ask questions, but they poke holes so much and push back so much that other generations can get a little bit defensive. But Xers say, I push back because I care. The other piece, too, with Generation Xers is they're latchkey kids. Parents were divorced or working, and so spent a lot of time alone. We like to say that they're that fiercely independent group who was told, if you want something done right, do it yourself. And at work, they're usually a group that likes to go away by themselves in an office. And they're like, just tell me what you want. You stay over there.
And I will get it done and just stay out of my hair.
Exactly, yes. So that independence is a really important piece for Gen Xers because it doesn't show up in the same way for the generations around them.
So millennials,
your
group.
My group.
Tell us about them.
I laugh because the millennials are so stereotyped. Every generation is stereotyped when they're young, but I, of course, hear it a lot. And the narcissism and the entitled and lazy, it's thrown on our generation all the time. But if we really look at those events and conditions that shaped us, one big one is technology.
Yes.
And every generation experienced changing technology. I mean, from the personal computer to bag phones, there's always been change in tech. For us, that change is happening so fast. I mean, it was happening at a blistering pace. And so we like to say that we're the generation who grew up on this upgrade cycle. We're waiting for the next Apple invention. And because of that fast change, sometimes we're seen as a group that wants instant gratification or we're impatient. And really it's just the world that we're so accustomed to. So if change isn't necessarily happening around us, we'll create it.
Right.
And so that's a huge part of the technology piece. And another key component of that was it gave us this ability to connect all the time, anywhere, any place.
Always on.
Always on, exactly. With that comes this sort of collaborative nature. And when you look to compare to Gen Xers, I mean, Xers were, want something done right, do it yourself. We
Right.
are, there's no I in team. You know, 2 heads are better than 1, 3 heads are better than 2. We always believe in putting our heads together. So we're a hyper collaborative generation.
That's very much a positive.
It can be, it also can't be, honestly. Sometimes if you think about a very independent Xer who's managing a hyper collaborative millennial.
That's a tough combination.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. Because this millennial, while they might, want to work independently, they're gonna wanna check in with their manager 5 times a week. And the manager's saying, hey, we can just check in at the end of the week. I trust you to keep working. We don't need to have all these touch bases. So the collaboration is positive, but in some ways it can cause challenges.
It's very different.
It's very different. The other key piece too I want to mention about millennials is we grew up in a time of homeland violence, and every generation experienced violence. We look at millennials as the generation of 9/11, of school shootings. As a result of experiencing all that violence, what happened is the adults in our lives, they said, I want to make you feel safe. The world is really scary.
Yes.
So they asked us to speak up. So we became super comfortable sharing our feelings and sharing very, things that you wouldn't usually talk about. We talked about it with adults all the time. It was our parents, it was guidance counselors, it was teachers, it was principals. And so when we look at people in positions of authority, we're kind of looking to them as comrades because we've been having these very candid conversations with them from a young age. And of course, in a lot of environments, that's not really the relationship to have right away.
Right.
But for us, it's really important. So, and it made us also incredibly close with our parents. We love mom and dad. There's lots out there that shows that, but boomers and millennials have a very, very tight relationship.
Now, the millennials, they've had a challenge in the workplace too, as far as getting jobs, similar to what the boomers did. But the differences that we are seeing between the boomers and the millennials, the boomers' parents looked around and said, figure it out. I don't care if you've got 8 of you in an apartment, move out.
Move out. We don't want you here. Yes.
No, you're 18, out.
Yes.
You're on your own. Right now, the generation of 35 through 18, there's more of those living at home than there has been since 1880, when we are in a more agricultural situation.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see that affecting all of this? Are we going to go back to a multi-generational household as the norm?
We could, honestly, and we don't know for sure. I mean, it's really hard to tell, but that is happening. A lot of millennials moved back home right after college, myself included, and it was more accepted. Like in the past, it was your parents saying, love you, bye-bye, don't come home.
Right.
But for our parents, it was like, oh, sweetheart, you need to come home, I'm here for you. What can I do for you?
Right.
You're going to change the world. It was a different kind of conversation. And so what we're seeing even now too is that those millennials who are 34, say they're married, they want to buy a home, they move back in with mom and dad to save up for buying a home. We work with a lot of housing development communities and companies, and they're saying that millennials are coming to them and they say, well, I want to make sure I have a room in my house for my parents when they get older. So they're already planning in their forever home to bring their parents back. That tight bond, I mean, it has some lasting power.
Clearly, the relationships with family are very different.
They are different. They are. And I mean, and every dynamic has an importance of family. It's just how that fleshes out is a little different. So for example, Generation Xers, because they grew up being alone so much and because there's so much divorce, they have this real drive to make sure their nuclear family is always together. It's similar to what baby boomers did for their kids, but it's really for prioritization. Things like job and things like saving might even come a little bit lower if the family is number one.
So millennials are going to be less likely to be willing to transfer all the way across the country and leave family behind.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, there's the group of millennials who all they want to do is travel, and relocate to live in really cool places and go all over. But when we look at when millennials, quote unquote, settle down, which they're doing later.
They are much later, 10
Much
years,
later.
10 years later than the previous generations.
Right. And when they do that, there is a bit of a trend to see them go back to home, to go back to be close to mom and dad. And so it's kind of like do all this adventure, have all these experiences, and then come back home. Whereas some Xers might have been, all right, great, I'm going to have my family, I'm going to have my career, and then when my kids go to college, I'm going to travel the world. And so it's kind of this, we're seeing now too, a lot of Xers are empty nesters even now.
They're just starting to get all those children out of the
Exactly,
household.
exactly. And it's kind of like, all right, this is fantastic. Now I can take that next step in my career that I've been waiting around to do. I can take that trip I haven't taken. So it's a different kind of dynamic a little bit.
So all these things, they impact a value system that comes back to a very important key is how are each of these generations that are now in the workforce, how are they motivated in terms of compensation, vacation versus salary versus what they're doing, the values of the company of what they're doing. And there's also the impact as well as the independents versus the ones who like to be collaborative.
Right.
How do we bridge all these different generations in the workplace?
It's with patience, I would say, and flexibility. So overall, to bridge all those gaps, it's about setting expectations about what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. We find many times when we work with clients who are really struggling, they just never set expectations, and then they're frustrated when people don't know their expectations. So it's setting expectations, it's being flexible. The workplace demands us to be flexible now. It's no longer strict hierarchy and everyone gets in at 8 o'clock and everyone leaves at 5 o'clock. The world has changed so much because of technology. And just open communication, which is easier said than done.
Yes.
But that's kind of the overall tips, I would say, to bridge gaps. But when you get into the nuances of all those values, like you're talking about, there are so many that get fleshed out in very different ways. So for example, if you look at work ethic, and I'll ask you because you're a boomer, what were you doing in your first job?
CPA firm.
CPA firm.
Out of college.
How did you prove that you were working hard?
I worked more hours. I produced more work. Does that sound like a...
Yes, such a boomer. I mean, the long hours piece, just like thinking about, you knew that you had to work those hours.
I did.
Yeah.
You had no choice. That was also the expectation. There was the issue going into your profession or getting a job when for every one job there were 35 well-qualified applicants, and if you wanted to keep it, that's what you did. There
were so many rules and things that you had to follow because being fired, quote unquote, it was an easier thing to do at that time.
Yes, very easy to do.
Right, and now, I mean, over time, we look at that hard work that boomers had and expected to have, and it's changed so much over time. And so we see these millennials, for example, Xers paved the way for balance, where they said, I don't want to work those hours. I'm going to try to work more efficiently if I can to get more work done. And so in the beginning, it was like Xers leaving at 5 o'clock and saying, I'm going to my kids' baseball practice.
Right.
And the boomers in the room who'd been, working 100-hour weeks when they were that age were thinking, it's a practice, buddy. It's not even a game. Like, there's work that hasn't been finished. That's the beauty of what's happened over time, is that there's been this lessening of an expectation that you have to work 100 plus hours a week. And so boomers and Xers have paved this wonderful path for millennials to come in and have a different expectation. But sometimes that expectation, what happens is that it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to come in, I'm going to work hard, but kind of on my own schedule. So we hear these challenges of millennials who want to come in at 8:30 instead of 8 because they want to go to a fitness class and they want to leave at 4 o'clock to go to an appointment, but they'll hop back on their phones later. And if there's an environment where there are people who expect you to be there at a certain time of the day, or you have clients calling, you need to be here when the clients are calling.
See, that's the challenge for the employer. So, say for financial services, the market's open, these are the hours.
Exactly.
You have no choice. This is when they're open.
Right. You eventually find the ones who want to be working those hours. They care so much about the work and their clients that they're willing to come in when they need to. And then it offered flexibility of, well, you can come in at 10, it's completely fine. We just ask that you stay to be with this client at 6:30. And sometimes just that amount of flexibility is all anyone really is looking for of any generation.
So let's get into the question that is the big one for all the generations.
Mm-hmm.
How do they all view money? They definitely have different attitudes toward it.
It's so much grounded in their events and conditions and what they've experienced in their life and where they're at in their life stage. But if you look at a traditionalist, for example, versus a millennial, completely different views of money.
Yes.
So for traditionalists, it is the taboo topic that you never talk about. You don't talk about money, which is a huge challenge, of course, amongst families.
And estate planners, we're trying to get them to open up. Please don't let your family find out what it is that you have after you're gone.
Right.
Let's talk about it in advance so they have an understanding of what's coming. It's a very much a challenge for financial advisors.
I mean, I can only imagine. And seeing all of there's varying statistics out there, of course, but the high percentage, 90% according to a Pershing study from a few years back, but we're going to move firms upon receiving their inheritance because they don't know what they have. They don't know who the traditionalists, parents or grandparents are even talking to. They don't know who they can trust. And so if traditionalists don't start finding a way to have those conversations with their family about money, it could have a trickle effect. But then, of course, you compare that to a millennial. And when you ask a millennial about money, there can be a giant question mark, right? It's like, I have no idea. What's a 401k? And of course, there's some savvy people who are like, I'm going to take charge of my finances. But in general, it's such a question mark. And for a group that was very heavily impacted by the recession, they're very open with talking about money.
Right.
They want more people to be talking openly about it because there are so many question marks. Traditionalists, they don't want to be a burden.
Yes,
like, I do
that's
not,
the right word.
I do not want to burden you with my health. I don't want to burden you with my money. I'm fine. Just don't even worry about me. And you ask them questions, they're like, I'm okay. Because they don't want it to be about them. And that has changed so much for other generations. It's like, I do want it to be about me. I want to talk about what's going on in my life and what we can do about it. Just because in the mindset of a traditionalist, it's a burden. But for other generations, it's a burden not to talk about it.
Yes, it's a very much of a burden. They have no idea what they may be facing. Proper wealth management is intergenerational. There has to be an instruction mechanism for each generation going down.
Right.
And that's where I'm seen as a financial advisor a lot, where millennials that are not around their parents, they don't have the time, they don't have the understanding, and we've got to capture them and bring them in because I look at them as the lost generation on the money issue. They need lots of instruction.
It can be really embarrassing to ask those questions for millennial too. I mean, when I talk to advisors, it's so important to have this conversation of, how are you communicating with them? Because what works to communicate with their boomer parents, like, they don't want to be spoken to like a kid,
No.
but they also want to be spoken to in a sense of, if you have questions, it's okay to ask. Yeah,
Yes.
I'm here.
Right.
Like, I'm not going to think you're dumb because
That's my
you
role.
don't know.
You're supposed to ask questions.
Yes. And for a millennial, I mean, so many of them, they fear that they're going to be condescended to. And I think that so many of them have to get out of that mindset because they won't if they just ask.
The boomers are going to suddenly all be retiring and leaving the workforce. So Gen Xers who have been there longer is going to suddenly have a lot of management positions opening up. And they're going to be now managing a lot of millennials. So let's talk about that a little bit. A lot of things are going to be changing.
The biggest fear is that everything that boomers have been working on for so long, there's so much institutional knowledge that they're going to leave with.
Right.
And then how do we get that information to make sure that we are not going to be set back, for years? Some companies have alumni programs for boomers where they come back after they retire. A lot of boomers don't retire anymore. It's kind of like going to the next stage or having an encore career, seeing these boomers come back just to provide knowledge that is so needed. Because, boomers are not going to all of a sudden just open the floodgates and say, yeah, I plan to retire in 7 years. Here's everything that I know. And I think for younger generations, Xers and millennials alike, it's figuring out how do we have this conversation where we can both learn from each other to make sure that when we go into that next stage of work, how are they going to change the dynamic of a work environment? What Xers are so different? They're independent, they want balance. Managing millennials, I think, is going to be a bit of a challenge. Where we're seeing one of the bigger collisions is between that independence and collaboration. It's going to have a many layers of complexity and challenge when we look at boomers retiring. So right now it's kind of the question of what are we doing for succession planning to make sure that everything is in place. Biggest thing I think that especially millennials can do, and Xers too, is to ask boomers questions and to seek them out for knowledge. And when we talk about the values of boomers, it's youthfulness, it's optimism, it's idealism, the can-do attitude. It's not like that's gone. Boomers still have a can-do attitude. They still want to make an impact. They want to help everyone around them. But we as other generations, we have to start those conversations.
When we arrived in Minneapolis yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
one of the first things that impressed me was how much has changed here.
Yes.
This progressive city and its
Mhm.
gentrification and all the millennials and the Gen Xers that were here that have moved back here.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about that process a little bit and what's happening across the country.
It's happening a lot where that younger demographic are moving into the urban center, and it is very exciting because it's like breathing this new kind of life into cities and the housing developments that are just popping up all over the place. And who they're attracting are millennials who are not ready to settle down yet. They're drawn to a world where everything is connected. So the appeal of the suburban sprawl is less a little bit, and it also allows you to live this kind of customized life, so to speak. So it's drawing these millennials who are not yet ready to get that first home, and then it's also drawing baby boomers who are sick of having a home. Like, I don't want to take care of things anymore. I would like life to be simpler. Some boomers too are also doing that because they've seen their own parents isolated in their homes, and they aren't able to drive anywhere, they aren't able to do anything, so they're seeing more boomers in there, and Xers are coming back as well. And so there is this vibrance and this economic increase of people being attracted to the urban center, which is very exciting and very positive in a lot of ways.
Do you see that changing at all when the millennials start having children?
Yes, I honestly do. Millennials are starting to have kids. A lot of them, we work with, those housing communities who are trying to appeal to the millennials who are sick of renting. They're sick of throwing their money away. They want more space. Kids take a lot of space. And the majority of millennials, if you look at the statistics, it's upwards of 80 to 90% of them want to buy a home. It's just at what time, where, of course, all that being said, maybe Generation Edgers are going to come into those apartment buildings. Maybe those apartment complexes right now that are dominated by 25 to 31-year-olds, it's going to be all baby boomers in the coming years. So that could happen. I think it would just be a shift in a community mindset at the same time.
So give us your last pearls of wisdom and helping us learn how to bridge all these different generations.
Make sure that you allocate time equally amongst all the generations to understand the nuances of what differentiates an Xer from a boomer, from a millennial. We like to say, and of course we're all similar. We all want to be happy. We all want to be challenged. We all want to be in a good financial standing. But at the end of the day, we are different, and we need to be communicated with differently. And so it's taking the time to really understand, how are the generations different? Why is that such a great thing, and how can I capitalize on those differences? It's crucial to look at it through that lens, because when we get to stereotyping or to negativity or to putting a blanket of, but we're all the same, those differences are what make us who we are.
It's interesting because I look at this and I'm looking at the full circle.
Mm-hmm.
And the millennial, they actually have many of the values that the traditionalists had. So we're almost doing a full circle.
We're actually really seeing that the teenagers, Generation Edgers, are showing the traditionalist mindset even more than millennials. The younger millennials and the older Generation Edgers, because of how old they were when the recession hit, they saw families lose homes. The way that you view the world is so different, so you're going to cling on more to what you've got.
Yes.
You're going to make more sound financial decisions, and it really shapes differently how you see the world. And so that circle is coming back, and I think that the circle, like right now, it's at kind of 90%, but I think it'll be at 100% when you get to those who are about 16 years old right now. So it's very interesting.
History repeats itself.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Well, Hannah, thank you so much. I so appreciate your insights.
Thank you, and thank you for the conversation.